thanks everyone and also thank you to the team and the staff for this incredible lunch in this space. I'm loving all the conversation that everyone's having. Someone was telling me to just, in passing, someone was saying to me it feels like a reunion. We're seeing so many friends and fellow travelers, and actually having some time to be in space together is really fantastic. So the last panel really set a high bar for all of us of just throwing down, right, and really challenging us with some hard questions and hard truths about what it's going to take to actually build the kind of power and make the kind of transformations that we want to make. And we're hoping in this panel we can continue that trend and really push the conversation. So I'm going to introduce the amazing speakers really quickly, and then I'll say a little bit about sort of the frame for this panel, and then we'll get started. So starting to my left and working down, we've Felicia Wong, President and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, Anat Admati, George Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Chris Hughes, co-chair of the Economic Security Project and a co-founder of Facebook, Alison Hirsch, Vice President at 32BJ, Service Employees International Union, Erica Smiley is the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, and Lauren Jacobs, Executive Director of the Partnership for Working Families. And I'll say for myself, these are all people who I've learned a lot from over my years, and so I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. So to get us oriented for this conversation, the theme for today is realizing democracy, and I think the challenge for us in these next hour and change for this panel is to really think through three questions. The first is, how does economic power concentrate, and how does it preclude the kind of democracy that we're trying to build? The second question, which is a corollary to that, is if we're serious about realizing democracy and getting to the kind of liberation and emancipation that we deserve but that we have not yet experienced, especially for working families and Black and brown people, what does that mean about the very fabric of our economy that has to change? And then the third question is, how do we do this work, right? What are the relationships we need, the strategies we need? What do we in this room and we in the social change ecosystem need to do differently, right, in order to get there? And I feel like we're teed up for all of these themes in the last panel really nicely. So to get us started, I wonder if Felicia, you can kind of help us open up and paint the big picture for us for a moment. How did we get here? What is the sort of intellectual and ideological construct that we're having to go up against, right? And just help us kind of understand where we are at this time.
Am I on? Well, thank you. Thanks, Sabeel. I am really excited and honored to be on this panel with people whom I have also learned a great deal from. And again, thanks to the Ford organizers. It's kind of an amazing day. It's conference, yes, conference. But like there's art and there's videos and like it's really the multimedia element of this, I think, speaks a lot to the kind of movement we need to build. So at any rate, you've given me a small question, Sabeel. Let me see how I can handle this. I think my job is to tell the story of how the, quote, neoliberal worldview ate democracy for lunch. And I'm supposed to do that in like 3 minutes, right? Okay, so I have 4 points. Let's see if I can make them relatively succinctly. The first point is that neoliberalism, which is now the sort of bête noire, everybody uses the term, but really by that we mean a kind of conservative market fundamentalist idea about how we govern the economy. So neoliberalism was never just an economic project. Yes, Milton Friedman, economist. Yes, Friedrich Hayek, economist. But, their very idea of how an economy would work said that you had to have economic freedom, you had to have a very weak state, or you even had to have a state that would, quote, encase the market and structure the market so that it basically saved corporations, protected corporations. So this, in and of itself, is an anti-democratic idea for how to structure the economy. It never recognized power. The economists who were trained, and we'll say more about this, the economists who were trained within neoliberalism, which is basically anybody who ever took Econ 1 in the last 50 years, never recognized power, wished power away, and that It's just wrong. So that's my first point. My second point is that as neoliberalism gained power in the real world in the 70s and in the 1970s and 1980s, it built this really weird alliance, these really strange bedfellows. So yes, you had the economists. They hung out together at Mont Pelerin. They went to Chicago. They studied what they studied. But they started to make common cause with politicians, most notably Reagan and Thatcher, people who could actually take power. So you had the economists and then the politicians. Then they started to ally themselves with the social conservatives, the evangelicals. Okay. And then to that coalition, they added the people who were fighting against the civil rights movement, basically white supremacist, racist, anti-civil rights organizers. And so you end up with this very strange alliance of, again, people who are intellectuals, people who are social movement organizers, people who actually, and then people who actually know how to get and maintain power. And so you have this neoliberal coalition that really shouldn't make any sense, except that the only thing that they agree on kind of as a spine of their worldview is that corporations are going to bring prosperity, corporations are going to bring good. And as you can imagine, if this is the coalition, two things happen. One, the kind of anti-democratic nature of neoliberal ideology is made worse by its actual political instantiation. And then the other thing is you have this kind of shape-shifting coalition that is kind of take what you want and leave the rest. Okay, so I don't really buy the whole Milton Friedman thing, but I am a church traditionalist, and so that's the part of the kind of belief system that I can hang on to, or vice versa. So you have the inconsistency within the coalition actually brings a kind of political power. That's my second point. So neoliberalism starts anti-democratic, gets more anti-democratic. So then the third thing that happens is that neoliberalism as an economic exercise fails, right? Empirically, on its own terms, neoliberalism does not do what it's supposed to do. Neoliberalism is supposed to bring us more growth, measured strictly by GDP. But simply on those terms, we've had less growth by about a point on average since 1980 than in the 1945 to 1980 period. So neoliberalism does not bring us more growth. It brings us a kind of flatter economy. Okay, well, neoliberalism then is supposed to bring us a kind of better distribution. You know, more people are, let's trickle down, more people are supposed to get higher wages. Well, that doesn't happen. You actually see much more inequality. I do not need to recount the statistics, but much more inequality under neoliberalism than previously. Okay, so it doesn't bring us growth, doesn't bring us distribution. At least it's supposed to bring us greater stability, right? It's supposed to like solve the problem of the business cycle. But actually, you know, you see more market cycles, obviously, and most famously, most infamously, the financial crisis of 2008. So neoliberalism fails on those terms. And then finally, neoliberalism at least is supposed to provide a labor market whereby people of different racial backgrounds are supposed to be able to compete on their own terms. If you have the skills, you should be able to get the job, et cetera. Neoliberalism essentially says that you're supposed to be able to compete away racial prejudice. I don't need to say to anybody in this room what actually happened. You actually see greater racial and gendered wealth and income disparities now than you have in a generation. So empirically, the neoliberal experiment just fails. So that's my third point. And then finally, and it's part of what we talked about this morning and part of what we'll talk about for the rest of today, this kind of the empirical failure of the economic experiment actually makes all of those anti-democratic tendencies even worse. So what you have is a world in which very big corporations, as I sort of said in that video, very big corporations basically run our politics. there's many different, the body of literature on this is now increasingly strong and increasingly persuasive. Many of us kind of know it in our gut that big corporations are going to get what they want out of the political system and regular people aren't. But, you know, plenty of political scientists now have the data to show that. Let me just give one more statistic. It's a slightly different one. But, you know, on average, the top 4 companies in any given sector control 35% of the campaign finance funds, almost 60% of the lobbying funds. They win their fights 80% of the time. People like us, public interest lobbyists, win our fights 10, 15, 20% of the time, which is actually pretty good given the financial disparities that we're up against. But I just want to say it does not have to be this way. The economist Thomas Philippon took a look, compared the American results to the European results. In Europe, public interest lobbyists win about half the time. Now, maybe that's not enough, but that is certainly better than we're doing in the United States, and that is because we have written rules here that are simply not in the favor of all of the people in this room and the people on whose behalf we are, with whom we are organizing, fighting, and trying to win some kind of public good. So that's kind of depressing. The rest of this panel is going to talk about all of the ways. I'm actually not at all depressed about this because I think we are in this moment of real change. But I think the rest of my fellow panelists are going to talk about that.
Yes, and hopefully we'll get to unpack some more the responses to all of this. So this, to make it concrete a little bit, Anat, I wonder if you could help us talk through, you know, what were the things that changed in our policy arena, in our legal arena, that actually allowed for that concentration of corporate power?
Thank you, first of all. Thank you for inviting me. And for me, it's not a reunion because I don't know most of you. But I look forward to. I actually am going to be on Monday in a setting in which I know more people, or at least I have hung up more at, which is a forum in the New York Fed about too big to fail. And it would be mostly industry people where we just fight it out and lose as usual. But anyway, I sort of maintain that battle, which started in the financial crisis. So until then, I am from Stanford Business School, and I was in that set of people who believe in many of the principles of markets, and that's what we teach about financial markets and all of that. The financial crisis was a symptom and an eruption of something that has not actually changed. The fact we don't see what's wrong does not mean that a ton is not wrong. A lot is wrong, and they didn't fix it. Don't tell anybody. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So, and so that's a mystery. Why? What is going on here? Why is the public not getting what it needs out of the people controlling the financial system in particular, and more generally, some corporate systems? The answer to the original question is, you talk about corporate power. What does that mean? We have non-citizens, but legal persons with a lot of power. The way they gain their power is not marching on the streets, because corporations can't do that, but in the courts usually. So a lot of it happens behind doors and in the circles that I can see how these sausages are made. The obstacle is both in the way the decisions are made and in what's called thin political markets, in the way in which expertise on sort of subtle things, but really underbelly things that are a little bit more abstract, technology, financial regulation, accounting rules, et cetera, are playing out, where it's very easy to confuse the public about what's really going on. And so so this morning we had some echoes of that. You got to know where the problem is. You got to move your tent to in front of the New York Fed instead of, and the whole political narrative, it's not about socialism and capitalism. It's about corruption, is what it's about. And it's about governance and accountability. That's what it's about, in private sector and in public sector. And what we need to then focus on is, again, like in some of the logos, who makes decisions, exactly how it's playing out. And unless we educate ourselves about these issues, all the other issues are okay, but the power play remains a little bit invisible, and the right people are not always at the table.
That's great. Thanks, Anat. And I should say, as a reminder to folks, if you're tweeting the event, use the hashtag Realizing Democracy. And if you have questions, please put them in Slido. We'll get to questions, hopefully, with enough time to unpack some of these points. So, Chris, turning to you for a moment, you've really taken a big stand for sort of pushing on this new frontier around debates around anti-monopoly in the tech sector, but also more broadly. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about where the fight around corporate power is evolving at this point.
Well, I'd love to. Thank you, Sabeel, for convening this great group, and it's an honor to be in the room. Old friends, new friends alike. If I could get to that point around what's happening around anti-monopoly, just by picking up where Felicia left off. First off, it is so important to tell ourselves again, and then retell another time the story of how our economy and our politics have been taken from the people. Because it really is a story of not just economists, but powerful interests, corporations, academics. You go through the list, and it's been a concerted effort over the course of decades. At the same time as we do that, I think it's very important to talk about what we are fighting for. And this is directly related to the anti-monopoly conversation. I think fundamentally we are fighting for a vision of the state that is pursuing the public good without corruption, without capture, and that says quite clearly, markets work for us. Corporations don't work for shareholders, they work for us. And this is the way in our history we have organized ourselves that has benefited the most people through the 30 glorious years, glorious for some, not so much for others. But from an economic perspective, it was clear there is one way to structure the economy that is better than the other. And we have now a generation, maybe multiple generation long fight to take that economy back. So this is why I think anti-monopoly in particular is so important. So first off, just to define terms, why are we talking about anti-monopoly and how is that different from antitrust? Anti-monopoly, at least the way I use it, is a term that encompasses any kind of government action to rein in the private power of corporations. That can include, firstly, antitrust, kind of break up the big companies, but also like other structural remedies like releasing patents, et cetera. Secondly, it can include regulation. So anybody who tells you that breakup won't solve all the privacy problems, for instance, with Facebook or elsewhere, is purposefully trying to distinguish these issues to put breakup and reining in corporate power aside, because any kind of historical view on the role of anti-monopoly has tied regulation with structural reforms from the get-go. You can see that in multiple industries. And then third is the idea of a public option. So specifically, state-based enterprises that compete with private ones. We use that phrase most often with healthcare, but you could also think of swimming pools, community pools, or public transit, or even Social Security as a retirement savings vehicle as a public option. For those who are interested in that, my friend Ganesh Satarman has an amazing book that just came out a month ago. You should definitely read it. All three of these are techniques to rein in the private power of corporations that are on the state to solve the problem. So when I had a piece that came out in the spring that called for Facebook breakup, the first question that I kept getting asked, which some of you were there, I was like, well, why can't Mark Zuckerberg just fix this? We have been so trained to think that CEOs are going to solve all of our problems that we've lost the language of talking about government being not only part of the solution, but in the case of anti-monopoly work, the core of it. So at this moment in time, there's a huge amount of interest in anti-monopoly, largely based around tech. And the challenge that I think I'd like to submit to this group, and something that we should think about as we move out of this room, is how do we take all of the momentum that's happening around big tech in particular right now, the fact that the calls for Facebook breakup are being taken quite seriously. There's an investigation in the House of Representatives. Senators on the Senate committee are interested in an investigation by the FTC, by the Department of Justice, now by states' attorney generals, for Google, et cetera. Every branch of government that could be paying attention to this is great sign, but how do we make sure that isn't just a moment, firstly, and then secondly, isn't just about tech? Because as much as Facebook and Google and Amazon and other companies are a major problem, it's also agriculture, healthcare, pharmaceuticals. 75% of industries in the United States have grown significantly more concentrated over the past 25 years, not by coincidence, but because we have not been pursuing any kind of real anti-monopoly policies thus far. So this is an area, I think, of real hope for progress, but also for uniting the political dimensions of this work with the economic, because they both come together very clearly in the anti-monopoly fight.
It's great. Thanks, Chris. And if we putting the three of your comments together, Felicia, Anat, and Chris, in a way, we're starting to see a picture, right, of how the commanding heights of the economy have really been rigged in favor of a more of extractive and concentrated form of corporate power. And I'm also struck by two things I'll just kind of put on the table as we turn to the second half of the panel. Is that there's a tension, perhaps just a narrative tension, but maybe more in how much of the project is a rolling back of the things that the policy shifts that were made over the last few decades, right, to allow for these new forms of corporate power and inequality, and how much of the project is a making anew, right? Because of course the mid-century, sort of the golden era of capitalism, so-called, was itself highly racialized, as you were pointing out, Felicia, as a number of you mentioned, highly racialized and gendered and extractive in its own ways. And so there's a bit of both, right? There's kind of things need to be undone, but new things need to be built. And then a second tension I'm hearing is that the role of government being critical, and also how do we ensure that government actually does the things that we want it to do and serves we the people. And I mentioned that just as in the spirit of sort of the connective tissue in some ways between the different panels, right? Each of the conversations we're having on each of the panels today kind of needs the other to actually be real. And so with that in mind, let me turn to our second to sort of think about how we're building the type of countervailing power among people on the ground to actually reclaim and democratize the economy in even more radical ways. And so, Allison, I wonder if you could start us off and just kind of help us think through where the labor movement is going at this point, and how the role of labor has always been, but sort of continues to be critical to all of these fights.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sabeel, and it's an honor to be on this panel and in front of faces, many of whom are familiar, many of whom are not. And I just want to start by painting a little picture from a column by Mara Gay, a New York Times columnist, that came out actually right after the funeral of my former boss, the president of 32BJ, Hector Figueroa. And she wrote at the end of her column, "It was a tantalizing glimpse of how America can move beyond what divides us to fight for what should unite us, the dream of good jobs, healthcare, the environment, and human dignity. It was a beautiful rebuke of the racism and hatred that has stolen so much from us, that continues to bamboozle us. Labor unions, when led wisely and empowered by motivated workers, can defend democracy itself." And I feel like that, I wanted to sort of open this with that image, because it's true. Unions are a unique structure that, there's been a lot of talk over the last many years. The labor movement is dead. Unions are dead. We shouldn't be collectively bargaining in a traditional way anymore. And there are glimpses of that, speak to some truths, or the traditional shop by shop organizing of 5 workers here, 5 workers there is not going to radically change our democracy. But unions, when they are sort of the ideal, which is where diverse workers from a variety of demographic, racial, gender backgrounds come together to fight against a united enemy, and realize that the power that they actually have power together to defeat that enemy, right, and force that enemy to respond to their needs, demands, the dignity that they deserve on the job, it fundamentally changes the people's ability and workers' ability to envision a different future and a different structure of government in our country, and what their voice can actually impact. And so, the idea of, unions, I think, and progressive unions are doubling down right now on organizing workers across this country. And you've seen it both in sort of traditional unions like 32BJ or the teachers over the last, couple of years in places that we consider to be anti-union territory like West Virginia or Oklahoma or Kentucky, standing up, taking collective action, fundamentally changing the nature of politics in their state through their workplace actions, even when they don't legally have the rights to join a union. And you see it in places which are with low-wage workers, like just yesterday, actually, in New York City, the New York City government fined Chipotle over $1 million in fines on behalf of 30 workers at just four stores, over $1 million from 4 stores in New York City, because they found these workers are organizing, they're fighting to join a union, and they found that Chipotle was not following the New York City's Fair Workweek laws. And about an hour after the city announced those fines, Chipotle stock went down. And the workers are, and more workers are coming out, and this is just the beginning. And so when workers can come together and realize that they have shared common interest at the workplace, that extends to government, that extends to all of the democratic institutions that we rely on to fundamentally change the economic structures in our country that are grossly unequal. And so, I just want to tell, sorry, I'm like losing my place of thought here. But so I think the realization that workers across sectors, and particularly, I just want to pause, workers that were originally left out of labor law. I mean, I do want to say that one of the fundamental pieces of sort of the resurgence of the progressive labor movement is focusing on workers, black, brown, women, who were fundamentally left out of the original labor law models, and saying, we're not taking that, and this is to Sabil's point about going back to what's good from the old and adapting it and changing it to establish the new, to make sure that we're not just resurfacing and redoing all of the inequalities and, without fundamentally changing. And so, take the taxi workers, the Uber drivers, the Lyft drivers who are organizing and just had a phenomenal win in California this week. Is one example. Everybody should clap. Yes. Everybody should clap. The domestic workers who are organizing and continue to build power, the fast food workers, these are all folks who were traditionally left out of farm workers in New York who won their organizing rights earlier this year, who have been traditionally left out of the historical labor movement, that are now organizing and not abandoning the traditional notion of collective bargaining, but they're scaling it and adapting it for different industries. And I'll just stop by saying that I think those kinds of unions, and they'll look different than unions of old because the work sites are different, the type of work is different, but these unions can fundamentally transfer the power that they're building at the work sites, or, we talk about work sites, but in their taxis or on the farms or in the homes they're cleaning, right, into democratic power, lowercase d democratic power that will fundamentally change how the government is structured in the country.
That's great. And thank you, Allison. And this sets up to Smiley. You all have been doing such great experimentation and sort of pushing the envelope on, what collective bargaining could mean in an even broader way. And wonder if you could talk a little bit about all the great work y'all are doing and just keep pushing us forward here.
Sure. I really appreciate this panel, and I really appreciate going after you, Allison, and this notion that collective bargaining is, in fact, a fundamental principle of democracy. And I was looking at this poster when I was looking at the panel, and it says democracy is a practice, not necessarily an end game or an end result. And collective bargaining has always been a way for people to practice democracy. Democracy is not just a system of political practices. It has to be applied to participation and decision-making on all fronts, particularly in the economic arena. And it is really important, and like you were saying, Allison, that we see the work site as a place of struggle, just like we would an election or in any other political arena and activity. I'm from North Carolina. I'm from one of those places that was forgotten. I think when I left North Carolina in 2000, we were the second lowest in union density. I think we've now surpassed that. We're number one. Not much to be proud of there. And similarly, so there's a very low threshold for economic democracy in North Carolina, and of course the political democracy will follow. If one doesn't exist, the other will suffer. The entire system will be compromised. It's interesting because I grew up in a place where I was very much connected to organizing and to working people trying to claw their ways out of poverty and to have a real voice and say with employers and other corporate economic stakeholders. And I was organized through my church, and I remember my first fight was with these women, mostly black women, who were trying to win dignity at Kmart, where, at least from my teenage mind understood, was that they were being discriminated against. They were getting lower wages because they were women and they were black. Fast forward many years later, I decided, I want to go back to the labor movement. I want to work with get back to what I used to do with workers. And one of the first questions the union asked me in an interview was, well, where else have you worked? Like, what labor experience do you really have? And I said, well, wow, if labor experience is defined for working for a traditional union, then we've already lost. Because the people that I know and the people that I worked with to build power and collective bargaining didn't have access to a traditional union. Now, where we do have access, like in California with the Lyft drivers, like in New York, we should still win. We should still fight for collective bargaining agreements as we've known them. We should still win based on 20th century unionism. But where we don't, there's actually a much bigger appetite for us to get creative and, again, to actually think about how we're applying this leverage of democracy, this idea of organizing and collective bargaining in that arena, whatever the economic circumstances are. It's funny because as much of a union supporter as I am, and I'm ride or die, that when you go to my hometown and you say you have the right to join a union, you get blank stares. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, why is that? Is it just because of, okay, sure, years of political, ideological pressure, like Felicia was talking about, right? We're in the region of John C. Calhoun and economic liberty, right? It's also, years of industries of union busting and making it bad. But, there's still a hungry. There are people who are fighting, like you mentioned earlier, in these places for dignity and respect. Why is it when we say the right to join a union, it goes blank? And I think it's because of this. When you go to that same place and say, you have the right to elect a senator, they look at you like, okay, that's great. You don't say that. You say you should have the ability to vote. You should have the ability to participate and engage elected representatives and pass policies you want. So then why are we treating collective bargaining as if it's some kind of end goal? It is, in fact, a practice for democracy, whatever that looks like. So we should say you have the right to organize and collectively bargain with other people who are in a similar economic relationship as you are against the same common enemies or the same economic stakeholders. And you should be able to organize together to withdraw your participation from that economic relationship in order to get them to the table to negotiate, to have voice, to be able to participate. That, in fact, is the fundamental cause of democracy. That's why unions have traditionally been called schools of democracy. It's because of this practice of collective bargaining. And what we do, and part of what Sabine was asking in the beginning, is saying that we say that needs to be applied writ large, where it can be applied at the workplace and where you can win a traditional New Deal form collective bargaining agreement. We need to win that. That's a gold standard. Where we don't have that access, we don't need to wait for the laws to give it to us. We need to actually begin to practice collective negotiation wherever we are, whether it's a tenant association at a large building owner, a set of debtors or homeowners at a large bank. The point is for us to organize around our own economic relationship to capital and to try to negotiate based on that. That is actually the fundamental practice of democracy. That's ultimately what we are trying to get at. And so many people are beginning to experiment with that because they have the appetite, whether they know it's a union or not, whether they know the history of it or not, they have the appetite to actually come together and negotiate around their economic conditions. The last thing that I want to say is that, ultimately, in this society, the economy has changed in ways that are jarring. We talk about the gig work. We talk about the disparateness of the American work site. There aren't these large factories in the same way as there might once have been. But the power that we have to organize hasn't necessarily changed. The power, as I like to talk about it, in relationship to our ability to disrupt production, our ability to withhold the skills of a particular market, our abilities to associate, all of these abilities to essentially withhold our participation in an economic relationship and get our stakeholders to the table so that we can then have a voice and negotiate, that hasn't changed. What has changed is the need and ability of us to apply that beyond what the current rules allow us to apply it to apply that to all the new economic relationships, whether you're a Lyft driver, a garment worker, or a farm worker, that we actually have to apply that, organize, and then try to win and get to a position of collective negotiation. A collective bargaining agreement is nothing but policy in a workplace, just like policy in a community. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get to. And the last thing I'll say is that despite not having the legal protections to do that in the overwhelming majority of the country, we do actually have the power to do it in the overwhelming majority of the country. Certainly, if my ancestors had waited for the legal right to vote, I still probably wouldn't be here voting, right? And so we can't wait necessarily for the legal protections to give us the ability to collectively bargain and fight for democracy. We have to organize ourselves and take it.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. Thank you, Smiley. And so, Lauren, I wonder if you kind of piggybacking off of that, PWF has also been sort of thinking creatively, right, about what are those new forms of people power and also governmental power that we're trying to reclaim to wrest control back of the economy. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work that y'all are doing.
Yeah, I thank you, Sabeel, and thank you with the cohort of folks that put together today's event, bringing us all together for this conversation. And thanks to the panelists for really some brilliant analysis and ideas on this. I do want to sort of go back to something that Felicia started on this at the beginning of talking about neoliberalism not only as an economic project, but as an ideological one. And I want to sort of put why I answered the poll this morning. I was in the, democracy never exists, but we'll miss it when it's gone camp. I don't know where my 48% people were when I checked the poll last hour, but hey. And I want to go back to that and really sort of say that I think that we have to move out of the frame of trying to fight back to sort of an idealized place and really sort of embrace this making of the new. Both because I just think that there's a pragmatic point of view that we have to adopt. We're in a fight. And so I'd rather not start the goalpost on the imperfect system that some of us grew up in, our ancestors were even worse states on, and sort of start the goal line there and have the fight about where we land and somehow end up in the middle versus the really anti-democratic state that they're trying to enact. I'd rather have the fight based on what my heart and vision of what could really be collective democratic practice be. And so that's what I want to sort of frame when I'm talking about today. I think similar to many of the folks up here, I will echo, yes, democracy is a practice. It's a muscle. It's not, it's been said already, it's not marking a ballot. It's not something you do every 2 years. It is the practice of being in community with people. I think it's the practice of listening to folks. It's the practice of loving people, not in sort of all the ways that we think of romantic love or familial love, but in the ways of really sort of caring about a collective entity called our neighbors. Maybe it's our workplace. Maybe it's the folks, the parents and other kids at our school, but there's some sense of a collective. And that really is the site of the contest that we're in at this really volatile political moment. Is the other side is constructing a we, and most of the people sitting in this room are excluded from that we. And we have to be vigilant and really clear-eyed about that we need to be constructing a different we. And that we can't just be in words, it's got to be in the actual day-to-day practices that our organization are bringing forward to really sort of paint a picture of what could be real democracy. So the Partnership for Working Families, we're a network of 20 locally based organizations were coalitions. So, and that's really sort of based in our belief of like, we believe in team sport, right? So that is really sort of the idea that it takes unions, it takes worker centers, it takes environmental organization, it takes religious organizing groups, it takes tenant organizations, it takes all those civic institutions combined with the power of yes, elected leaders that really do feel and want to continue to be accountable to those communities to enact, our vision of democracy and to actually transform conditions in the economy. So it is through bringing together and supporting all those organizations, which are sort of real life places where people sit and they hear from their coworkers at the work site. Because I may go to my union meeting. For folks, there are some folks in the room that know this. I'd spent 17 years in labor movements, so I'm not imagining this. I have seen this in practice. But people sit in the meeting, they come in, and they're like, "My big issue is that I don't have like the right work gloves for the job." But they sit in the meeting and they hear like, "Well, actually, everybody else's issue is brakes." So I think that's more important, and people learn the practice of like that. Making decisions like this are not about sort of acting as a consumerist, because I think that's the other thing to know, that the other side is constructing, is that voting and the act of acting in public, they talk about it as though you are buying a product. Vote your interests. Vote your family's interests. They're not talking about vote what you know your neighbors. What are you seeing in your community? And so unions, tenant unions, all base building groups provide a practice and a muscle by which folks learn how to be in community and also know how to make collective decisions and sometimes sacrifice individual things for greater good. And we see that in terms of thinking about how do those collective forces come together within cities and within towns and within smaller regions at the place closest folks, the government that's closest to people, and think about actually not only taking power in those institutions, but also transforming them. So moving outside of just sort of the traditional, well, we elected somebody and hopefully they do this. How are we as a community engaging in 2,000 conversations about the transit system, transit station that's going into our neighborhood? How are we, now that a large tech company is going to build a mega campus smack in the middle of our downtown, potentially displacing lots of folks, taking over a transit center, what is our vision collectively as thousands of us in Silicon Valley about what should be the community in which we live? And that I think is what we all need to invest in and grow and scale.
Great, thank you, Lauren. So there's a lot on the table, and we have time to sort of break up the flow of the day. We have time in small groups coming up in just a moment, and then we'll sort of come back to the panel with more kind of questions and sort of cross discussion. Just as a way to, before we get to that, I just wonder if I could just kind of give one quick prompt to just the panel to kind of connect up these two parts of the conversation a little bit, right? Because what I'm hearing is sort of a couple of different fights that are happening at the same time. So one is a fight to sort of reclaim the levers of government, kind of what Anat, Chris, Felicia were talking about in the beginning. The second is a fight to sort of change the way we think, or reclaim the way we think about organizing people from the bottom up, right? And building on the tools and practices that we have. But then there's a third one, which I hear hinted at sort of as you were talking, Lauren, and Smiley too, that the range of things we talk about when we talk about economic fights, maybe that needs to be a bigger set, right? It's not just about taxes and budgets, but public transit, or like the things. Are there some things that are actually more central that we tend not to talk about when we're trying to rebuild the new forms of power? So I wonder if just if folks have any sort of reactions to one another what's been laid out. Like, are there some as you think about the work ahead, we can't be everywhere and we can't fight everything. So like, what are like the one or two things that are most central for the field, for people who are involved in this work to really try to focus their efforts on? If you have a quick thought on that, and then we're going to turn to small groups in just a moment. So, yeah, open. Go ahead, Smiley.
You want to go into the war room fast.
Yes, exactly. Quick thought. We're going right now. Yeah.
Well, you said earlier something that was really important in your video about economic. People try to pass a law, and then that somehow is going to fix like the economic problem that they're facing. And one thing that I think that we've learned in our campaigns and our work is that there's government and there's governing. And part of what our fight to do, part of what we're trying to build alignment around, is that people should have some access to governing in every economic relationship that they face. And in some instances, that means reclaiming existing levers of government, for sure. In other instances, we might need to actually build something new and give it power and authority to do that. And so that's ultimately, like, when we think about it, it's not necessarily that there's going to be one commanding height that we all should put our energy and resources into, but we do need to build an alignment around what it is, how we're defining victory. What are our metrics of success? Our metrics of success have to be that an overwhelming majority of people impacted in a situation have access to governing and setting policies for that situation, right, for that economic situation. The last thing I want to say really quick, and this is a southern version of really quick, so it's not very quick, but whatever, that's cool. Really quick, the last thing I want to say is that when we're thinking about the levers of power, like you think about the 1937 auto workers, the Flint, Michigan strike, right? And they stopped that line, that assembly line. That power didn't go away. It may not necessarily sit with the same set of workers. We could argue that many tech workers and many of the data cloud warehouses have that same exact power if they so organize themselves. And so in this moment, it's really important to analyze the economy, where the power in the economy is, and the workers around that power, like to organize around that relationship to it, and ultimately try to get into a position of governing, whether it's through a collective bargaining agreement or some other form of collective negotiation.
That's great. Did you want to get in on that?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, we need to fight back about this, government's the enemy. So that's really important. And then how to make the government actually work. My main solution when it's like all so depressing is really around education. I mean, I am an educator, and so I realizing that the problem is a combination of lack of financial literacy as well as lack of citizen education about some of the most basic issues in sort of how the economy works. I'm not teaching undergrads with nothing, but I think that civics education is sort of too naive the way it's taught in high school, and we need to increase the awareness of people about how the place works.
I think we're seeing a lot of plus ones for Smiley's very quick. Last quick thought.
I would just say that we too often think about what's the next fight in terms of policy, right? Which policy is going to be the most important? I remember in 2008, there's a lot of disagreement amongst different, is energy policy going to come first and then immigration policy going to come second and healthcare going to be third? Obviously, that's not how it turned out, but, and who was going to get in line for what? I think that is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. We should not think about it in some kind of policy line. I think there are a couple of different criteria that we ought to think about when we think about what's the most important thing to put our energy in. And the first is this a lever that really is going to move and change power? I happen to think that taxes right now are a huge lever, but I don't think that I think taxes are a super important lever because that's what the right essentially built their coalition on, because taxes basically control revenue and you can tax away oligarchic power. So I happen to think taxes are really important. I can give an argument for that. I just did. But I don't want to, I think the more important thing is to think about what's the fight that's going to actually gain us power and help us build a strategy to enable us to be better for the next fight. Which then gets me to the last point, which is as long as it meets those first two criteria, building power, keeping the strategy, making for a better strategy the next time around, stronger strategy, then I want to be in a fight with all of you, right? I want to be in coalition. It is more important to fight with a group of other people for something that is in general good than to get my thing on the table first. So.
Right. Absolutely. That's great. So, and that's a great place to sort of pause for a moment. So what the plan for the rest of the session is that we have some time, like we did previously in the last session, to pick up on these themes in your tables. We are super conscious as we're putting this together that the brilliance in the room is so great that there's a little bit of a funny thing about being up on stage when I know who all is out here and the great work that each of you are moving, right? And so I think we all share that. So just to name that. So our hope is that in your tables, we can kind of pick up on the themes and really thinking about, I mean, there's a prompt here, but it's really what we've talked about in the panel so far, right? What are those critical shifts, proposal reforms that would be most central from a power lens, right? If we're bringing this lens around rebalancing the economy and realizing our democracy and the central thing there being power, right? The reclaiming of power, whether it's governmental power over the market, the power of people to govern the economy in a different way, as we've heard from the panelists. What might we think about the choice of fights and strategy coming in this moment? Because we can't be everywhere, but with our powers combined, can we do something that is more than the sum of all of our efforts and resources and impact in the world? And whatever else you feel moved to talk about, we'll then reconvene after some time to then take questions for the panel, have some cross conversation, keep putting things in the slide and we'll reconvene in a few moments. How much time do folks have? 15 minutes, great. So 15 minutes break, get some coffee, discuss, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, so lots of great table conversations, lots of side conversations. There's lots of coffee and cookies for which we are all grateful. So thank you, everybody. So we have a little bit of time to pick the conversation back up as a full group and try to connect some of these pieces together a little bit. So at this point, then, if I could invite folks to share back some of their thinking or questions, and you can do this in two ways. If you have a question, you can, like in the last panel, there are two mics on either side, so we can take a couple questions. But also, really would love to invite folks to share a reflection or something that really stood out in your table discussions or your side discussions that you want to add to the group conversation. So floor is open, and then we'll take some kind of reactions, some further thinking from the panel, and then get everyone to the next break before too long. So questions / report backs. Alex, why don't you start us off?
Hi, Alex Hurdle-Fernandez. Thanks for a great panel and a very stimulating discussion. I was hoping to ask a question about political coalitions, both their construction and their maintenance, because this is something that came up in both Felicia's comments about what has been successful about the right, thinking about the ways in which it tied together otherwise quite diverse constituencies, as well as in some of the other comments about what revived labor movement that thinks not just about traditional unions, but about new workplaces, environmental issues, even religious groups would look like. So what are the right ways of thinking about structuring coalitions for realizing democracy and then maintaining them over time when they might have very different sets of issues that they prioritize, different strategies, different funders, and different levels of government?
Great. So no small question. Great question. Thank you. So anyone want to take a first crack?
Sure. So I think the fundamental thing is, is having the long-term commitment, the groups that are there. It is committing to a long-term commitment to the other groups at the table, the other constituencies, and really sort of getting to understand the issues and the practices and the culture, and understanding that those things are often quite different. That's another way community or we shows up, as in sort of cultural practices that we sort of don't think about. I also think the other very important work is, that some of the stuff that comes up as the tensions and coalitions exists more at the sort of managerial level, but at the constituent level, oftentimes we're discovering, this is, every organizer knows this. We will be, I will be at the union and talking to leader X, and they will be like, well, I was just at my, Power Philadelphia meeting, right? So that they're also a member of a Faith in That. So there's people are, in multiple organizations occupy different identities. So I think at sort of the end of leadership, it really is sort of getting to building, trying to weave together a collective vision and also trying to tie together how the issues intersect. So like one of the ways that we've threaded that needle is try to think about how do we build campaigns together at which multiple different issue bases win simultaneously. So it's not just a choice between like housing or jobs, but it's thinking about how is it housing, jobs, and green housing, right? So that all three are woven in and that we're driving on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Allison, and then if other folks, I see another next question lined up. Go ahead.
I would also just add to what Lauren said that I think really the key to successful long-term coalition building starts with a bit of a generosity of spirit and an understanding and transparency and about vision and goals, and the understanding that different folks at the coalition table might have a completely different strategic imperative or tactical assessment of a situation or strengths. So take 32BJ, unions are never, or almost never, traditional unions are never going to be the disruptors. It's just not how we are structured or how we are built or what our role is. And so we need to understand that and admit that to ourselves and say that out loud to our coalition partners. And the folks who can be the disruptors need to say, we'll do that part, you do a different part. And actually, and vice versa, or who actually is really good at the advocacy and who's good at the mobilization and who's good at sort of the community engagement and who's good at the inside politics to actually like get the deal done, and having to be very open, honest, and transparent about that, so that when different people's way of viewing the world from their own strength contradicts another, you know where the contradiction comes from, so you can work through it in a productive way and get to a productive conclusion and not just get mad at each other because you're, have a different opinion. And I think that is a really crucial component of a successful coalition, especially when you have so many competing institutional, organizational, or individual interests that often will collide.
Yeah, I think Anat and Felicia want to get into. And
I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, that unfocused anger created a situation in which more polarization can happen even on issues where, it's really a case that everybody can examine their own assumptions, or where where things got grabbed by parties that are not really, including, reproductive rights, climate, that weren't as party divided as they are right now, where a party just took over something. And so I think that there are a number of issues on which, if we kind of really break them beyond sound bites, we can actually agree on much more, including, say, a place where I know more, but we don't have time to discuss, so I'll be happy to discuss later, is like housing policy, for example.
Felicia, and then I've got two questions in the queue.
Yeah, I would just say that, I run a policy shop. A lot of the people in this room are organizers, but some are policy folks, and I would just, speaking for my fellow policy wonks, people often think like, oh, you policy people, you don't really need like you write papers, you don't need coalitions. I actually think that's totally wrong. Policy people need coalitions more than anybody else, both because great policy is only built with lots of different voices as inputs and lots of different minds at the table, and because policy only gets you so far. You need to be working in alliance with organizers, economists need to work with lawyers, political scientists need to tolerate, sociologists, et cetera. So I just think that policy people should be thinking about policy people need to also be thinking about alliances, and I would actually go one step farther than that, which is to say, I actually think what we need is long-term friendships, meaning the kinds of relationships where even if you disagree, because of course you disagree, I can see lots of people in this room with whom I've had actual disagreements, but you're not gonna get divorced over the disagreement. You're gonna figure out how to work it out and keep on fighting, because if you don't have that other person, who do you have? So I think it's very important for wonks to also think about friendships.
Barbara, please, go ahead.
Well said.
Well,
I don't have much to say, but I do want to say that one thing Can you hear me now? The one thing that I learned from the right, and in particular from the Koch brothers, is something that on the progressive side we never do, and that is make long-term commitments. We make grants for, speaking, from my experience in being a funder, we make grants for 3 years. I mean, on rare exceptions, it's for 5 years. But when things are so important, like maintaining a democracy, I think you got to say this is a 30-year project, and we are going to be committed to it for 30 years or 50 years, and we may not see the results that we want in the first 3 years, but that doesn't mean that we stop funding it. So that is all I wanted to say.
I feel like there's a lot of agreement on that point.
That's popular.
And then, sir, go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Martin Trimble with the Industrial Areas Foundation. I wanted to ask Mr. Hughes whether he thought the fundamental right to organize, which has been under assault for the last 30 years, that needs to be restored, is important to your goal of challenging monopoly. And I don't know you really, and are you publicly talking about the right to organize?
I think it's absolutely essential to it. I think that's why I talk about anti-monopoly instead of antitrust, is because it encompasses exactly the historic movements of labor and others, but to rein in corporate power. Because antitrust gets us into a very narrow lane very fast, and it can get very technical, and it sort of strips it of the spirit, and the traditions of the movement and the organizing. So that's a particular way, and it's not just me, by the way. I mean, in the room today, again, there are so many leaders in this movement, whether it's open markets or there's a long list of folks who are working on behalf of these ideas. Just to connect it, though, with some of the other things that were being said in the previous moment, I do think that the long-term, developing the long-term relationships of trust is so key. And Felicia, I really like your marriage analogy because we're in this together, and I think that is the kind of fundamental place. And part of that is being honest and saying, to your question just there, it's a yes. There are other, there are other questions or other perspectives that it wouldn't, sometimes we say that our missions don't align. And I think being honest with one another in the movement about where there's alignment and where there's not is the way that we can build the long-term trust that can power us.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Smiley.
Yeah, I want to build off of both Chris and Felicia on this last point, because I feel like there are, one of the things that's really important for us to note is that there are movements and there are institutions, and there's a symbiotic relationship between both. We need each other. Institutions essentially make sure that we implement the victories that movements won. And I really appreciate Barbara's comments, not because I just want to suck up to Barbara, although, I wore my pink shirt. But anyway, it is important because at the fundamental nature of it, we get frustrated with each other, and it is a 30-year project, and it's messy. It is messy. It is not cut and dry. There's not one plan and then we just implement it. It is a sloppy thing. And so when we talk about the nature of coalitions, because Jobs with Justice itself is also a national network of local community labor coalitions, like ultimately what we're talking about is agreeing to be in that relationship long term in order to make some of these bigger, higher values real in the world.
Yeah, that's great. So we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. I see 2 questions at the mic. So, and Lisa as well. So can we collect representing the over? Very good. Okay, great. So how about this? Let's collect the 3 questions, and then we'll have time for just like one lightning kind of final blast. So please go ahead.
So my name is Wendy Fields, and I run a very large coalition called the Democracy Initiative, and I spent 20 years in the House of Labor in the auto industry. And we stand, I think it's a fitting conversation to be having at the Ford Foundation. And I appreciate it. So I just wanted to appreciate the conversation and feel like we're moving it, but I want to ask a very big question. I almost feel like my 20 years, 25 plus years in labor movement of running strikes, getting workers to take risk, was easier than running a coalition. Because the risk and reward is clear when workers are fighting, whether it's in Mississippi or workers in rural American Iowa. There's not many places I have not been and sat at and been privileged to sit at tables and watch people take more risk than I think many of you can imagine. So I just want to put that there in center and sort of focus to say, what is the reward we're willing to risk to get? And I think we started that conversation downstairs, and I wanted to hear from you a little bit, Felicia, if you could, just to put you a little bit on the spot here. And I invite you to our coalition, because you can come any day. What are we willing to disrupt, or who should we be focused on disrupting to get that big reward or that big idea? I see Allison Barlow, and I always pick on her because she's always on me about this, but what is that big, what do we have to risk? I'm not sure that we've answered the question, each of us, what are we willing to risk to get us that massive change? I thought your most powerful statement was 4 companies, top sectors, winning 80% of the time, clearly corroding our political system and corroding the quality of all of our lives, right? So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about focusing ourselves beyond ALEC, right? And thinking about the power we do have, which is a lot, and we still have a lot of resources as we stand in the House of Ford. What are we truly talking about disrupting, and how do we do that beyond the Occupy movement, et cetera?
That's great. Urvashi, go ahead.
Hi, Urvashi Vad, activist, former worker at Ford and other places. The conversations made me think about, the persistence of market fundamentalism and how it operates. I really appreciated everybody's interventions, and my question, it made me think about that while we are organized around campaigns, our opponents have a party. While we're organized around issues, they have an ideology. While we're organized around platforms and policy solutions, they have kind of hegemonic or build institutions that are promoting a hegemonic worldview, media institutions, academic centers. We have those too. I'm not saying we don't, and the progressive side at all. My question really was, it made me think about what new formations would the panelists love to see if you could dream and invent anything, either a synthesizing of existing stuff that we have or a ramping up of something like the Working Families Party or whatever the idea is that you think could enable us to advance these great ideas that we have on our policy platforms and our campaign platforms and our things, but that aren't scaling to the kind of power that Barbara was talking about, that our opponents have built through this kind of different infrastructure approach. I would call their approach an infrastructure approach and ours more of a policy approach.
That's great. And
mine builds on that. So from the overflow room, they want to know, we have a hard time even imagining what we, the people, having say over the economy looks like. Thank you, neoliberalism. Expand our imagination. What might the future look like?
Yeah, great. I think so. These all kind of connect to one another a little bit. We are very close to about end of time, and we were just getting to the juicy part. So I will actually cede my closing comments time and to create a couple last minutes for the panel to speak to any of the points raised. Really quick, we basically have enough time for like 1 sentence each. Why don't we start with you, Lauren?
You can dream, Sophia.
I know, right? I ask aspirationally, I say so. Go ahead, Lauren.
So I don't want to say that it's like the Socratic form of like the perfect thing, but I feel like I'm actually getting to be part of something that may be pointing towards where we need to go. There is an initiative of close to 50 organizations that are working on the concentration of power in the e-commerce sector. If you think about it, you could think about what company that might be. And that is really sort of testing our limits about showing up for each other in real ways, of like sometimes sacrificing things because it's more important for other things to move forward, understanding that we're needing to negotiate the bounds around fundraising and other stuff, but it is really trying to get us to force us to think about ourselves as an ecosystem and a movement that is starting to have an ideology of what the economy should look like if it was in the hands of the people.
We can just come down.
Yeah, we're just coming down the line. Okay, all right, go. So I really appreciate the last couple of comments, and I think that part of what we need is to think about alignment across the board around these ideas of governing and of being able to participate in all aspects of society. Because then, you know, whatever the organizations are, whatever the institutions are in power at any given moment, you know, you could imagine that when an opportunity arises, we're making very different demands on that. Like when we think about the auto bailout in 2008, imagine a movement that actually was putting a demand to say, okay, if we're gonna bail you out, so when are the elections for us to be on your board? When do we get to start electing people to represent on the governing body of your company if we're bailing you out? And so I think the formations that need to be in place, if we can dream, and I love that question, Urvashi, is that, you know, I actually think that we need a lot more nimble and flexibility organization. I mean, we need essentially like Alcoholics Anonymous, but neither anonymous or alcoholic, like workers' clubs, where you can have, you know, self-support and mutual support, mutual respect, where people can make meaning together, where we can talk about these ideas, but where we can also have a container for solidarity and for solidarity requests. And in some instances, like an organization, that could just mean getting people to walk you back to work after you asked your boss for a bathroom break and are scared to go back in, you know? And so those are the types of formations that I really think that we should look at. And then the last thing I want to say when we're talking about building a future, if we practice democracy, if we practice a consult and confer in whatever community we're in, whatever work site we're in, then the point is not necessarily to set a vision that everyone buys into. The point is to build a vision that everyone can then see themselves into. And I talk about this a lot in the context of race and confronting white supremacy. If you live in a majority white working class community and you aren't talking about race, you aren't actually fighting white supremacy. It's not, you don't have to just go to the cities, but the point is to build a vision that confronts white supremacy that working class white people can see themselves in, right? That they're a part of the solution, not a part of just the enemy. And so I feel like it's more about alignment than about a specific issue or specific policy, but alignment around some of these fundamental principles and practices of governing.
That's great, Allison.
So you'd think we'd planned this.
There were a lot of commas in that sentence.
All good. That was amazing.
You think we'd planned this. I couldn't agree more. And I want to go back to what Lauren said earlier in her comments when she was saying democracy never existed and we'll miss it when it's dead. I think one of the challenges that we really face is it's hard to imagine something that we've not successfully ever seen. And to create the sort of coalitions that are beyond, we've never seen that work, right? We've never experienced that. And we need vision and we need imagination. It's actually why I think the Green New Deal resolution is so powerful. And I don't know if remember the video AOC did on where she draws, you know, the future that she can envision. It's like that kind of sort of working with our organizations, our members, our coalitions to say, like, if you could create our democracy over, what would it actually look like? And forcing us to imagine what has never existed before, I feel like is the linchpin that we need in order to sort of set up these more permanent movement, institutional coalitions that get us farther than sort of this policy win, that policy win.
That's great. Chris, last word.
These comments could, just building on these comments, I think that what we want is the kind of places, the kinds of towns, neighborhoods, cities that are vibrant, that are full and beautiful. Arlie Hochschild has this beautiful metaphor in her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, not the one that everybody knows about the line and people cutting in the line, but the other, which is a public park that everyone is not only enjoying but contributing to as a space of participatory democracy for the enjoyment of life, but also for the space to organize. And I think that requires us to set aside or at least contextualize numbers like GDP and sort of the raw economic data, and instead understand that what we're trying to build is a democracy where everyone can participate and everyone can thrive. And that means new numbers and a new conceptual framework.
Well, I don't want to be so Pollyannish, so I'm going to bring it back to, real fights. So if I had to prioritize, I would say Citizens United should be among the first things that we can get people around, even across political spectrum. So that we just have to begin to organize what democracy would look like. I just would plug that I would be around on the reception, and I didn't carry myself, but I had male people carry at the cost to Stanford Business School a bunch of writings and things that I'd be happy to not carry with me out of the building. So please help yourself when I set them up. Thanks.
I'm going to try to answer the question that was asked to me directly. This question, like, what's the most important thing to disrupt, which in some ways is a question, what's the hardest thing to disrupt? And I do think economics. I think, but even more than economics, I think economics is being disrupted right now by a lot of by many of my colleagues. So I actually don't think economics is all that hard to disrupt. I think it's something but I do think it's something related to economics, which is this notion, which is a very, very elite and class-based notion, that the people who run the Fortune 500, the people who have built those marble temples along Park Avenue, that they actually deserve the sort of the fealty that we seem to grant them. And that you can actually say, I bet everybody in this room would say, oh yeah, for sure, that guy who runs that big bank really did it because he really kind of cheated his way to the top. We can all say that. But really, if you are ever in a room with that man, and it's usually a man, you will probably treat that person with incredible deference. And so what it's going to take to disrupt this kind of idea that, that our current market fundamentalist economy is really deserving is the ability to genuinely not treat that. I mean, you should be polite to that person, but to not treat them with that kind of deference that I think is very ingrained in those of us who went to a fancy college, even went to a not fancy college. I think that's a very important kind of cultural and social thing to try to get past. And in order for many of us, I run an elite think tank. In order for many of us to get past it, what we're going to need on the other side is the kind of solidarity that Smiley talked about. Like when you challenge that bank CEO, who's going to walk you back into the room? Who are you going to call to say, I just asked that hard question. I just challenge, who are you going to call? And I think that kind of solidarity, that's why I think that people who do things like what I do, in addition to people who run worker organizations, who are workers and or run worker organizations, we kind of all need the solidarity because the fight we are in is an emotional and psychological and cultural fight, not just like a fight over the right growth numbers. So
that's great. So I know we're over time, and I'm going to hand to Lisa in just a moment to get us to the next phase of our day. But I do think we should put a pin in this last sort of round of conversation because we're really having two conversations at the same time, and they're both critical for this project, but for the work we're all in, and want to identify them explicitly. The first is that all of us, I think, are pointing to this need to see all these different fights as being part of the same larger fight, right? And so whether they're fights of economic justice understood in different ways as they were articulated on this panel, fights of about democratization on the last panel and on the next one, these are all facets of the same thing that we're trying to get at, which is a vision of a different kind of democracy, right? And so even knowing that, us in this room, is pretty important. That's a conceptual thing. The second thing is an infrastructural one that, Barbara's question, Urvashi's point, a number of folks sort of raised, and folks on the panel, which is, like, if everyone who's here today actually got a chance to meet everyone who's here today and have a real conversation, like, we'd be a good step forward in the sense that I would wager most of us know most people in the room, but not everybody in the room. And the kind of connective tissue, even just in constructing this panel or constructing this room, is pretty important for the ecosystem of just connecting dots, and so that we can operate on a 30-year time horizon. And so, like, let's offer that as an invitation to, like, we should live into this opportunity or this need to be a shared ecosystem, a shared community of folks pushing this fight for the next 30, 40 years. Thank you, everybody.